Viking Influence on English by Paul, Mallika, Anna, Jan, and Elizabeth. The Vikings were a group of Northern Europeans who greatly influenced the English language. They are the reason our language is relatively simple. They also greatly influence the vocabulary and grammar we use today.
While many may think the Vikings were Scandinavian-based warriors who raided the British Isles, the reality is that they are much more complex than that. These Vikings were warriors, traders, and colonists from Northern Europe. At the beginning of their interaction with the British Isles in the 7th century, they traveled by sea and focused on raiding to accumulate wealth, and specifically targeted monasteries, which contained precious metals. Thanks to their raiding habits, they were dubbed Vikings, which means one who lurks in a vike, or a bay, essentially a pirate. As the Vikings' homeland got more crowded, they started to settle and colonize areas in the British Isles.
The raiding done by the Vikings was due to ingrained and populace-based complications. As the Frankish Empire declined, trade ceased, and the Vikings saw an opportunity and took it. Also, because climates changed in the favor of human survival, the children of Vikings began to survive childhood at higher percentages. These children, generally born after polygamy, would leave Scandinavia in an attempt to gain their own fortune after only the eldest child received the father's inheritance. This led the other children to attempt to make their own fortune by raiding. Once Vikings left their homeland, they began to raid and pillage England and the surrounding landmasses. Generally, the Vikings would quickly attack the port or seaside village, steal all the valuables, then even the populations. After the attack, they would quickly leave and go back out to sea. They would continue to cycle these raids, weakening their opponents and constantly moving for better raids. As the Vikings exhausted the loot on the seacoast, they were forced to move inland to continue to raid. As they went farther inland, it would take longer to get home to Scandinavia. Thus, they founded winter bases to spend the winter. These bases would become the foundations for their invading conquest. The Vikings continued to expand the surrounding landmasses and even founded Dublin. In 866, Vikings conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mallika, seen in red, yellow, purple. Then they continued to expand until they met the mighty Alfred of Wessex. In 878, Alfred of Wessex was the first person to defeat the Vikings. After their defeat, their leader Guthrum decided to sign a treaty in which he was baptized, but also gained power over northwest, northeast, and east parts of England. This treaty was dubbed the Dane Law.
During this time, the Angles developed two speech groups. One group contained the Old English language, and the other included what would eventually become Middle English. The Northwest and Northeast spoke what would become Middle English, and was the part the Vikings gained possession of in the Dane Law. Here we see the language and dialects changing and becoming more similar to Old Norse. Eventually this would develop into Middle English. From streets to written documents, we see that Vikings kept using their language, Old Norse, when they colonized part of the British Isles. Old Norse is a Germanic language in the Indo-European family tree. The Vikings' language was very similar to Old English of the Anglo-Saxons and spoke in the areas they were settling. These languages were also Germanic and were very similar to Old Norse, so similar that they could even be considered distant but related dialects. But even though both languages evolved from the same one, Old English had become much more complex, and Old Norse had remained relatively simple. As these Vikings started to settle the British Isles, they brought their language with them and spread it through trade, farming, and eventually intermarriage, which would result in the vocabulary and grammatical structure being incorporated into Old English.
After the Vikings invaded Britain, they easily assimilated with the existing society. Before the Vikings, Germanic tribes had already settled and displaced the earlier Celtic languages and tribes. People in Britain spoke dialects of a Germanic language that was similar to modern-day Frisian English. Old Norse was also a Germanic language, and the two were very similar. Old Norse and Old English had some of the same basic vocabulary words, and Old Norse speakers could probably understand some Old English. Because Viking settlers were mostly lower-class farmers, their languages could combine in the speech of common people. Scandinavian words are still common in everyday speech today. Many English words come from Old Norse. People who lived in settlements where Vikings and British people combined confused Old Norse words with English, and the languages mixed together. In some cases, Norse words replaced the Old English words. For example, the Old Norse word egg replaced the Old English word e. Up to 1,000 common English words come from Scandinavian origin. Other words remained as synonyms from different sources. Old Norse also added sounds like G, K, and SK to Old English. Before the Vikings invaded, the sk sound in Old English had changed to a sh sound. Scandinavian words with the same root kept the sk sound. Some words in Old English and Old Norse have the same origin, but because the sk became sh in Old English and not in Old Norse, they developed into different words. Today, most words that have this sound come from Old Norse. Not only did Old Norse vocabulary combine with Old English, but Old Norse grammatical words were added to Old English as well. Modern third-person pronouns they, their, and them were originally he, him, and hera, but they were replaced by Scandinavian words. Borrowed vocabulary is common in many languages, but the switch of grammatical words is rare. One theory about why it happened in English is because the Vikings who learned English as a second language were confused by the similar singular and plural pronouns and started using the Scandinavian words instead.
In order to generate a valid argument for the way that the Vikings changed the grammatical structure of the English language, we must compare the differences in the language before the raids as well as after. For learning more about why the Vikings were attributed to the shift in grammar, we read a paper by John McWhorter. What happened is the simplification of the old language. In German, the root of modern English, every noun is assigned to a gender, masculine, feminine, and neuter. All of these categories have their own ending, which helps in deciding the article that is specific to the word that will follow it. For example, der, die, das, and die, conjugated for the different cases. Old English had a system just like this. Along with the addition of an article to all of the nouns, there was also an additional ending to specify who you were talking about. As you can see, English isn't the same as German. In fact, it differs from all other languages. It contains no ending attached to the verb sing, making it the oddball out. But what causes this drastic change in the grammar? Because there was a lack of language instructions and the Vikings were learning Old English much after their learning period, this is when children have the capability to pick up complexities in a language, there were recurrent mistakes and they picked up poor English. As they spoke with their knowledge of English, mostly gathered from conversation, these mistakes spread to the people they were communicating with, who were also likely learning the language on the fly. They would pick up new words as they spoke to the people who they mingled with, but it was likely that none to few actually had a proper grasp on the language.
There is one piece of evidence to targeting this grammatical shift in English to the Vikings. For the most part, the Vikings settled in the north with all the other Scandinavians. This made that area primarily populated by the Vikings. When documents were produced in this area, the language was poor and improper, compared to what was there before. The genders had been removed, and the language was on its way to one more comparable to what we speak now. This change wasn't occurring in any other place, therefore supporting the argument that the Vikings were the one who ultimately changed the grammatical structure of English. John McWhorter argues that the Vikings changed the language through the migration and mix with the Old English speakers, the commoners of the area. Vikings migrated into Old English-speaking towns and villages and married the women. Rather than just one group of Vikings coming over and staying, new waves were constantly coming over and settling up in the north, where they would be in the mix with the Vikings that had already settled down, maybe even started families. This essentially started the whole language process over again, and over time, this ate away at the language and arguably shifted both the vocabulary and the grammar. Because the children in this area did not go to school, they grew up speaking the language spoken by the parents, or the off-English. The Vikings were influential in shaping the English language. The similarities between Old English and Old Norse made it easy for Vikings and Anglo-Saxon people to communicate. Vikings were integrated into the daily life of many people, and their language was as well. Vikings contributed vocabulary words from Old Norse and changed the grammatical structure of English. As they combined with settlements in Britain, Old English and Old Norse mixed together to create a language that was even more simple yet versatile than it was before.